Freshwater mussels, or clams as most of us call them, can be found in pretty much every stream in the UP and beyond. And they're a lot more interesting than you may think.
They can move a short distance with their foot. It's not very quickly, obviously.
Then a look at a freshwater mussel survey in the Menominee River.
We have people that are scuba diving, snorkeling, and then we have others that are supporting those folks as they search for mussels.
9 million acres of forest, 1,700 miles of continuous shoreline, 4,300 lakes, 12,000 miles of streams, more than 300 waterfalls, 15 counties, 2 time zones, and 1 area code. Welcome to the Upper Peninsula. Welcome to 906 Outdoors. .906 Outdoors is brought to you by Cooking Wild Seasonings. Make it fresh, make it yours.
Today we're here in Dickinson County, and we're going to be surveying for freshwater mussels. So right here we have a creek heel splitter. You have the anterior side here, posterior over here, and then of course the dorsal and the ventral part of the shell. So they go in anterior side down. So if you're ever in a stream or a creek or a lake, make sure you put them down the anterior side because they filter up on the posterior side. They are filter feeders. They filter up to 8 gallons of water per day. They filter out detritus, bacteria, algae. They're pretty amazing creatures. They have a lot of unique names. Purple wartyback, there's fat mucket, spike. There's a lot of colorful names that we call freshwater mussels. And they may all look the same, but they're different species. Here in North America, we have nearly 300 species of freshwater mussels, by far the most diverse in the entire world. Most of the diversity is located in the southeastern portion of the United States. Alabama has 175 species of freshwater mussels. Here in Michigan, we have 45 species of mussels. And more locally, in the UP, we have 13 species of freshwater mussels. What makes them really unique, though, is their life cycle, how they reproduce. During reproduction, you have a male and female, and you have external fertilization. The female takes in the male's sperm, and that's where fertilization occurs. The female will hold the mussel larvae, or what we call glochidia, in her shell. For the mussel to complete its life cycle, it needs to find a fish host. The female mussel is burrowed into the sediment, and she needs to figure out how to get that fish to her in order to release her glochidia, or her baby mussels, onto the fish. She uses fish lures, mimicry. They can mimic little minnows, little crustaceans, macroinvertebrates. There's a variety of methods how these little creatures can entice a fish to come over and check them out. So once the fish does come over, the female mussel will release her glochidia near the fish, and the fish will, just through normal respiration, the glochidia will attach to the gills. This typically does not harm the fish, but they will insist on that fish. Usually it's over a couple weeks. Once they're transformed into juvenile mussels, they'll release themselves from the fish and go back down into the sediment and start the whole process over. They'll grow into adults and reproduce from there. And for most freshwater mussel species, reproduction begins when water temperatures increase. So generally in spring and summer, that's when most of the reproduction will occur. There's a few species that go into October, but the majority of them are definitely in the summertime. It's quite amazing. So that's what attracted me to learning more about freshwater mussels in the first place, is their life cycle.
906 Outdoors is brought to you in part by Blades Bait and Tackle, your year-round connection to fishing bait enoch.
Mussels have certain ecological requirements in order to survive very well. Since they are filter feeders, they need plenty of free-flowing water in order to be able to get food from the water column. They also need plenty of oxygen, like any other organism. They also need to live in an environment where there's low sedimentation. If there's too much sand coming into the system, they could easily get buried or suffocate. Their reproduction is largely jump-started by water temperature, so they need warmer water temperatures for that reproduction to start, as well as growth, but they can't have it too high, otherwise they're going to not survive well. So a lot of times you'll find mussels in what are called mussel beds. Since Freshwater mussels don't move very far. They can't go swimming looking for a mate. It's in their advantage to group together and live together in a mussel bed. So often you'll find, once you find one mussel, you find a lot more mussels once you start looking. Yep, see, so just another example of an ecosystem service that freshwater mussels provide. You see the freshwater coral here growing on the mussel. And it's not inhibiting the mussel at all, it's just utilizing the shell that's provided in the stream. And once it gets underwater, it turns bright green. If they do need to move, say, the water levels have decreased and they're along the shoreline and they need to look for more suitable habitat, they can move a short distance with their foot. It's not very quickly, obviously, but they're able to do it. Also, if, like, say, a chemical pollution event happened, freshwater mussels often are canaries in the coal mine. They can be very sensitive to certain pollutants. In particular, if there's high ammonia levels, you may see a lot of the freshwater mussels, their shells closed. They're not able to filter in those type of events. If it's a more chronic pollution event, you'll start seeing decreases in population over time. Unfortunately, sometimes that's what you'll see is a chronic event where mussels are decreasing. You won't necessarily see a huge high die-off, but when you do it, it can be pretty dramatic. For the internal anatomy, they have gills, and then they also have a foot that helps with feeding when they're younger juveniles, and also stability in the sediment. And they have exhalant and inhalant apertures. Sometimes the only thing you'll see when you're looking for freshwater mussels, they're burrowed so deep down into the sediment that you won't even see most of the mussel. So, and then they have muscles to hold the two shells together, and then mantle margins here. It looks pretty simple, but there's definitely necessary parts in order to make them complete their life cycles. So freshwater mussels are also known as ecosystem engineers, and they're pretty integral component to a stream. They filter out bacteria, a lot of potential chemicals in the system. They increase water clarity. They provide substrate for fish spawning populations. They also provide food for creatures and mammals that live along the river as well. Here is a dragonfly larvae, and he was living in the shell of this pocketbook. So even after they've died, they provide many uses for the animals that are currently in there. And you see his foot coming in. That's where he or she was stabilized. Some species of freshwater mussels are sexually dimorphic, meaning you can tell the difference between a female and a male. Not all of them are, but some, like a fat mucket, a female is going to be larger on the posterior side so she can have room to grow her glochidia and eventually release it in the water columns. Freshwater mussels are not the same as our aquatic invasive species mussels that we typically hear. They are not zebra mussels or quagga mussels, and they're not related as well. In fact, it's really, really important that we don't have zebra mussels or quagga mussels come into a system where freshwater mussels are, because the shells of the freshwater mussels provide perfect substrate for those invasive species to attach to. I've seen lakes where zebra mussels come in. Unfortunately, the freshwater mussel population, they can't compete. The zebra mussels just cover the shells completely. They're not able to feed, they just die out into a lake. So it's really important that we prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species, in particular those zebra and quagga mussels. So that is a spike mussel. He blended in very well with the rocks. Historically, it was thought that mussels were very important to Native American tribes. Historically, they used them for tools, jewelry, some religious ceremonies. And then you fast forward up to probably maybe the mid-1800s, there was an actual button industry. Before the advent of plastic buttons, we used freshwater mussel shells for our buttons on our shirts. Starting in the mid-1850s, there was about 40 button factories along the Mississippi River. We had button factories as well in Michigan. At its heyday, it employed nearly 20,000 people in America. So between 1857 and 1963, the button industry was estimated at a value of $10 billion in today's value. Unfortunately, it was left unregulated, and a lot of the mussel beds were depleted very quickly. So the mussel industry for button use did not last very long. This is another example of a pocketbook. You can see the thickness of this shell. and why, you know, before plastic, why freshwater mussels were so useful in our button industry. Shells range in very small to maybe like a quarter size, probably like a slipper shell mussel. This is a lot larger mussel. It's a pocketbook, and they can live very old, well over 50 years old. You can age mussels, kind of like rings on a tree. Yeah, each growth ring here, you'll see, is a year of the mussel's life. Count the rings on it, and that can be a good estimate of how old that mussel is. There's other species that are of freshwater mussel that are even bigger than the pocketbook. There's a washboard that's probably twice as big as this. So they can get very large, or like I was saying, they can get really tiny, like the slipper shell, like about the size of a nickel or a quarter. It is not legal for citizens to harvest freshwater mussels, so they can't take them. They can't even take the shells. But I highly encourage folks who are curious to learn more about freshwater mussels to go pick them up, look at them, check them out, and then gently put them back where you found them.
Today's show is brought to you in part by Rapid River Knife Works, home of Michigan's largest custom knife factory showroom. I met up with a group of researchers on the Menominee River during a recent freshwater mussel survey.
Well, what we've been doing here is following up on a mussel study that was done in 2012. At that time, the work was done by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And they had been looking at the mussels in the Menominee River at various points over the years. Since 2012, We Energies has done some work on the Twin Falls Dam. So the various agencies that are responsible for the river thought it was appropriate for We Energies to follow up on the study that was conducted in 2012 and see if there have been changes in the mussel community in that time period. Potentially anything that could be attributed to the change in the flow of the dam because of the new structure here. That's when Whitewater Associates was contacted by We Energies. We developed a plan to repeat that 2012 study with assistance from the DNRs of both states and others. There are two components of it. One is a quantitative study. We are putting out transects perpendicular to the river at set locations. We're using the same locations were used in 2012. And along that transect then, we are putting quadrats out. Quadrat that's about 0.25 meter by 0.25 meter. And at each of those we assess the habitat and we collect any live mussels that we find or see in that quadrat. In all, we will probably have nearly 1,000 quadrats when we're finished here. We will be able to tabulate the mussels that are present. The analysis of the data will take some weeks into the future. But what we do know right now is that we are finding all of the mussel species that were found in 2012. We are finding also young mussels, which is really good news because it means that the mussels of those species are reproducing here and continuing to recruit young ones into their populations. That's great news. The qualitative part of the study went to other areas in the river, but in that case they're meandering around the river bottom looking for all living mussels that they can find. A couple purposes for that. One is just to see, are there any additional species that we don't find in our quantitative quadrats that they're doing downstream of me here.
So this is a qualitative study. They're just trying to see the number of species that are here. So they just went out and collected and did what they call a timed search. They just go for a certain amount of time and look around. And we're also noting if the mussels are less than 4 years. The reason we do that is because to find a year-old mussel in a big river like this is really difficult because they're very tiny. And so we look at the age to see whether there's recruitment going on. Recruitment meaning that they've successfully reproduced and they're parasitic on fish. Some of these are really long-lived mussels. This one's probably like 15 years old. There is one here that is 2 years old. You can tell their mussels are like trees. You can look at the rings and look at the growth. A lot of the shells actually get very worn down. You really don't see this that much in the lower peninsula. So we're recording the wear on these too when we were looking at the quadrant samples. So you can see that one has a little bit of wear, this one does. Some of them didn't at all. There's a lot of diversity of mussels in North America in the family that we call Unionidae. This is the type of mussels that are the native ones that have this parasitic life stage. And down south, like in Alabama, they might have, I think they have about 100 to 120 species in that state. We have like 43, 44, depending on which taxonomist you talk to, in Michigan. And that's more diversity than some parts of continents across the world. So we have this really rich mussel fauna in North America. You can see what the different species. One of the things that's kind of unique, these are called floaters. They're thinner shelled usually than the other mussels, and they don't have any of these teeth that keep the shells from wiggling back and forth. So you can tell it's a floater because you can just gently wiggle it back and forth, because these teeth are absent. This is how you can identify these. They call them pseudocardinal and lateral teeth. And that's how you can distinguish some of the species if you're just looking at shells. So there's pseudocardinal teeth, and then there's lateral teeth, and then there's like no teeth. This is one particular species. It's in a more derived group of mussels. This one is, they're what we call lampsalines, and this one on the right is it's a female, and you can tell it's a female. The females actually brood the larvae in their gills, and so the shell grows around the enlarged gills, so it has a little bit more of an expanded edge there. And then this is a male, and it doesn't brood the gills, so it doesn't have the expanded edge. But these are really an interesting group, because there's ones that are in this group that have an expansion of the mantle flap that looks just like a minnow. So it's really cool to see it. You go down, when you're swimming or looking down, you might see something that looks like a minnow, and it's not really moving, but it looks like a minnow just sitting there, and it's to attract the fish to come in so it can infect the fish. So mussels are really important because in aquatic systems they provide habitat actually to aquatic insects. This is, you can see there's caddisfly cases attached to this, and they've done studies that show that it increases habitat availability for the caddisflies and the aquatic insects.
906 Outdoors is brought to you in part by Christ, your Northwoods neighborhood store.
Sadly, they just found 2 zebra mussels. These are old ones, and they look a bit worn. The zebra mussels have been the bane of native mussels. They like to attach onto the native mussels, and it's like having a couple of monkeys on your back stealing your foods. But the zebra mussels actually don't do well in fast-flowing water, so they haven't attached to any of these mussels, which is a good sign.
These zebra mussels are a non-native mussel species. All the other mussels that we're looking at belong here. They've been here for millennia. The zebra mussels are both competitors of those native mussels, and they are also a nuisance to the individual mussels because they use the hard shells of the native mussels as a substrate. And sometimes so many zebra mussels can attach to a native mussel that it can't sit upright in the substrate anymore, and it essentially dies of malnutrition or suffocates because it can't get enough oxygen because the zebra mussels are just clogging everything up. All of those zebra mussel populations were transferred to those water bodies upstream, very likely by people, boat and trailers and so on. It's why we are so adamant about cleaning our watercraft whenever we go from one body of water to another. Not just for zebra mussels, but the rest of the aquatic invasives that are out there, like spiny water fleas and some of the aquatic plants also that are deleterious to the environment, these aquatic ecosystems.
What I'm going to do with these shells is bring them back and deposit them into the University of Michigan's Museum of Zoology. They have one of the most important collections for freshwater mussels in the United States, and I'm depositing these shells as voucher specimens. There hasn't been a whole lot of information on this part of the river, so we can deposit these specimens in, and if somebody wants to come 20 years from now, and if there's changes or something, there's a record of what we found there at this point, and a record of the shells and what they look like. Sometimes this is needed because of misidentifications by people, or if some things are being the species are being re-evaluated, things like that. Anyway, and the other thing is, if you look at the collection records on the museum, which is offered to the public, you can do a search in their collection and find out what types of species are in that river. So we have a really great historical collection in Michigan. We're really fortunate with that. Some of the gunk that's on there, well, we'll try to clean them up a little, but sometimes that's useful if somebody was doing a study of some certain chemistry of things that were going on in the river. They could actually use the shells to look at some of that information, because the things that have been deposited in the shells at certain times, they've actually used mussel shells to look at heavy metal pollution, because you can see the times that the heavy metals have been deposited in the shells.
We have 9 people working in the river today. 2 people that are snorkeling, and then we have others that are kind of supporting those folks as they search for mussels. 2 scientists are using a canoe as their work platform. As we collect mussels, we bring them to those 2 scientists who are identifying them, measuring them, weighing them, determining the gender of each mussel when they can, and aging them. So that's every mussel that we find is worked up in that way. Every mussel that we collect from these quadrats, we replace in the same quadrat, in the correct orientation. And behind me, they're discussing that orientation, because we are about to release about 100 mussels that they just collected from one of our qualitative sites. So they place them back in the same position that they always find them, and so that the mussel can dig back into the substrate and go on with its happy life. Some of these mussels that we found are 18 years old. Not everyone appreciates how old an animal, what we as kids used to just simply call clams in these rivers, but they are a long-lived animal.
Feel free to join us on Facebook or visit us at 906outdoors.com. Thanks for watching, and we invite you to join us next week for another adventure right here on 906 Outdoors.